Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Mark Lutter. Mark is the founder and chairman of the Charter Cities Institute and is the founder of Bravo Cities, a new city development firm focused on emerging markets. Mark previously worked as lead economist for an early-stage charter city investment fund, and he has a PhD in economics from George Mason University.
Thank you, and thank you, Astrid, for that presentation. Thank you, Curtis and Patrick, for organizing, Marron for hosting us. Astrid, I think we agree a lot more than you give us credit for. Part of my initial interest in charter cities, when I was finishing up graduate school, I went to consult on a project in Kazakhstan, and it had a bunch of distinguished urban planners from MIT, and they were talking about, we can build a financial district here, or we can build it here. We can have, talking about zoning and land use. And I asked them, do you realize zoning and land use tend to increase housing prices? And their response was, no, really? And at the time I was a graduate student, but I realized that that was probably wrong, and there was space for kind of, let's say, more realistic new city planning going in. Additionally, before kind of getting into this presentation, I think we largely agree. You don't need to build new cities in the middle of nowhere. You can look at where urban migration patterns are and figure out how to build capacity in the new urban developments that are getting built. And many of those places lack capacity and lack access to financial resources. And you can structure those in a way that might not be a full new city charter city model, but still might have, let's call it, charter city-esque aspects. So I started the Charter Cities Institute 5 years ago, and part of the rationale was that there had been a lot of excitement about a decade ago because of Dr. Romer's TED Talk. That excitement had kind of faded as some of the projects hadn't panned out as initially might have been hoped. But that didn't mean the model was wrong. It meant that it needed to perhaps be tweaked. There needed to be a stronger ground game. But I think the fundamental idea that institutions matter for long-term development and reforming institutions on the national level can take a long time and be very difficult. And it can be easier to have institutional improvements in greenfield sites where you know people are going to move based on migration patterns, can allow you to have a quote-unquote institutional hack, make those improvements, and accelerate economic development and hopefully develop a model that can be replicated throughout the rest of the country. So at the Charter Cities Institute, what do we think about? We think about basically building a sustainable model. And this means, one, getting government buy-in. We work in many African countries, Zambia, Malawi, Zanzibar. We've done some work in Nigeria. It means making it bankable. How do you finance these projects? As Astrid pointed out, the financial systems oftentimes only function at higher income levels than the average urban resident. But these financial systems are not set in stone. It's possible to come up with new financial models to fund some of these projects. One project we're working with, small farm cities in Malawi, is building housing units for $4,000 a unit and is trying to get that down to $2,000. Patrick, I don't know if you're talking about it today, but he has thoughts about how you can push the price point down on new urban developments to make it more accessible to a wider audience. And it means making it replicable. And this is obviously not a one-size-fits-all model. It's a framework that can be applied and adjusted in different places. Once you have, one, government buy-in that you can show to other countries, and two, capital sources that you can go in and say, look, you have rapid urban expansion. You're going to have 1 million people living in this 50 square kilometer area in the next 30 years. Here's a framework that can be applied. We can ensure better infrastructure provision than if you do it yourself, because as a government, you might lack capacity. And part of the challenge I saw when starting the Charter Cities Institute was these stakeholders. How do you bring together governments, the development community? There are new city developers. Most of the new city developers are dumb, but some of them are thinking along these lines. And investors to actually get this model, get it to make sense, and get it to be applicable in these different contexts. So just to go through a brief kind of history of charter cities, self-governing cities have been arguably one of the dominant, or one of several very important forms of social organization throughout history. Sometimes they exist as entrepôts. For example, Dubai today is an entrepôt. So is Singapore. Sometimes they exist a little bit more as effectively tax farming. In the late medieval era, you had a lot of cities that were granted charters basically because the central governments lacked capacity to effectively collect taxes in urban environments, so they would empower a new city government to do it. The Penn Colony in Pennsylvania was effectively that, I believe. They were expected to pay about 20% of all land sales to the British Crown. Then you had some that were a handful of both. Lubeck is one of my favorite examples. It was one of the first cities in the Hanseatic League that challenged the nation state as kind of the dominant form of political order. In the late medieval era in Europe, they fought several wars against actual nation states, for example, Denmark, and won those wars to force them to open their borders to trade. And we don't have to go into this slide a little bit too much. There's already been much discussion on urbanization rates. We're basically in humanity's final wave of urbanization, and as mentioned, this wave is arguably more challenging given the average income of a new urban resident is much lower than it previously was historically. The US, we hit 50% urbanization at about 7,500 per capita. China and South Korea hit 50% urbanization at 4,500 per capita. Now we're seeing countries hit 50% urbanization at 2,000, 1,000, sometimes less per capita, which makes infrastructure provision much more difficult in these areas. Additionally, I think we all agree institutions are important for economic growth. What these institutions are, I think there is probably broad agreement in terms of make it easy to do business, make it easy to invest, make it easy to trade. In terms of context, I think that is very important. As Astrid pointed out, it's going to be different in the local context depending on local customs and norms, and that needs to be addressed. But in terms of a general, open kind of market environment, I think that tends to be very important for economic growth. Additionally, it can be easier to do reforms on greenfield sites than on brownfield sites. Getting urbanization right, both for physical infrastructure as well as urban governance, is critically important, because after these urban spaces exist, as we see in the US today, with NIMBYs, right? Like we're having trouble building a lot of new buildings in New York and San Francisco, right? Once you have these social structures coalesce and kind of become stagnant, it becomes much more difficult to make these reforms. And so taking advantage of rapid urbanization today to implement these reforms in areas that will have urban populations over the coming decades allows you to get ahead of the curve, and hopefully those reforms can be scaled up to the national level. Cities are the smallest economic unit that can have sustained economic growth. So if you care about increasing economic growth rates by 1-2 percentage points, a city can offer that laboratory that creates that sustainable growth. And lastly, these new urban spaces are going to be built. Sometimes they're going to be, for lack of a better way to put it, slums with lower income residents. New York had slums in the 19th century. I don't think slums are bad per se. They're a necessary part of economic development. And sometimes they're going to be these shining new cities that for rich people or for a politician's legacy project. But if these are being built, if these are being developed, let's try to make them a little bit better. So to talk a little bit more about Chinese economic growth, I think a lot of Chinese economic growth since 1980 was special economic zones combined with urbanization. This quote, except for railway, posts, and telecommunications, banking, civil aviation, national defense, everything was delegated to the provincial authority. Now, China created Shenzhen for several reasons. One, they realized that they needed a degree of economic development. Shanghai was the traditional commercial capital of China. However, because Shanghai was a bastion of capitalists, the Communist Party did not want to empower Shanghai. There was also population outflows from Shenzhen to Hong Kong because of the increased economic opportunity in Hong Kong. And so Shenzhen was one of 4 special economic zones declared in 1980. It was a success, arguably the single most successful instance of rapid urbanization in human history, in part because Mao had forcibly prevented urbanization as a defense strategy against a potential Soviet invasion. He was worried about dense cities that the Soviets would nuke and effectively allow them to take over China. So there was a pent-up demand for urbanization. There were a lot of human relationships between Hong Kong and Shenzhen that allowed effective knowledge transfer as well as effective capital transfer. I believe from 1980 to 1997, over 80% of foreign investment in Shenzhen came through Hong Kong. The first year of Shenzhen's existence in 1980, it attracted over half of all foreign direct investment in China. Labor market, land markets, financial markets, all of these were pioneered in Shenzhen before spreading throughout the rest of China. And Zhuan Du wrote a fantastic book on Shenzhen, I believe the Shenzhen Experiment, the Instant City, and she'll talk about that later today. Now, China had, I think, one thing that much of the global south doesn't. China had relatively effective state capacity. They've got a 1,000-year history. They developed the nuclear bomb in 1968. Obviously, it was a desperately poor country at the time. However, the governance was relatively effective. In many parts of Africa, as well as Southeast Asia, the governments lack some of that capacity, in part because of relatively low state history, in part because of relatively new education systems. So the question is, how do you improve capacity in some of these contexts? And this is kind of what the Charter Cities Institute has been advocating, is a special economic zone via a public-private partnership model to figure out how you can attract that type of capital to provide the necessary development for middle and low income urban areas, whether urban expansion or new city developments, that can create that framework partnering the built environment with the necessary legal and regulatory framework, as well as with the connectivity that can lead to success. One example, we recently had a call with a Zambian entrepreneur who's looking at doing a new city development in northwest Zambia, near Katanga in the DRC, where a lot of minerals are being extracted. And his idea was, look, partner with local chiefs to get a lot of land, have a profit-sharing agreement to acquire the land. Two is do public-private partnerships on roads to create road networks into the DRC that substantially cut the travel time down to save on gas and transportation costs. You do a city development on the border. Zambia is much better governed than DRC. That can offer some processing for resources, and then add that road network to Angola to allow for the resources to be taken to a port to be shipped somewhere that they are going to end up being consumed. Is this going to work? I don't know, but it was a relatively well thought through project, and I think given the kind of realism in terms of where population flows are, where trade networks are, it's worth poking at and seeing if it's worth spending a little bit more time and energy there. So Dr. Romer, in one of his previous talks, kind of created a taxonomy of 4 different types of cities. I added one. One is the foreign guarantor model, Hong Kong. The other is the city-scale special economic zone, which is Shenzhen. You have a private city, Jamshedpur in India is an example of this. It was started, I forget the company now, Alex Tabarrok and Shruti Rajapalan have a very good paper on it, starting on I believe, an iron foundry, and it's rated one of the better governed cities of India. You have new capital cities, Brasilia, Washington, D.C., Abuja, and then the addition I added was what could be described as a religious city, which would be Salt Lake City, Israel. It's not religious per se, but basically one of the challenges of a new city development is where do the people come from. And if you have a group that has a strong civic tie, typically religion, but not necessary, combined with a degree of persecution. The persecution causes mass migration. The strong civic tie coordinates that mass migration to a new place, and that can create the initial agglomeration for a city development. So at the Charter Cities Institute, what we advocate for is this public-private partnership model. And public-private partnerships are pretty standard, both in high-income as well as low-income countries. They typically focus on infrastructure, where it might be a bridge. And so private developer comes in, or government says, look, we need a bridge here. A developer comes in and says, we will build a bridge. It will cost us, who knows, $1 billion. And what we want is toll rights for 30 years so we can recoup our capital investment. Why do we focus on this model? I think one, it's politically tractable. I don't have the prestige that Dr. Romer does, so governments are a little bit less likely to listen to me on advocating certain things, and getting governments to buy into a model that they're familiar with a small tweak, allows us to get a lot of traction in terms of helping them deal with some of the challenges that they're well aware that they have. Additionally, I think oftentimes private sector actors can be a little bit more, let's say, innovative than government actors. We saw during COVID, for example, CDC and FDA, which were two of the most prestigious public health institutions, were a little bit slow and ineffective, to put it nicely, in responding to some of the challenges around COVID, right? They banned tests. CDC rolled out the test that was supposed to be the only test on the market and didn't work, and there's a lot of other stuff that happened. But a lot of high-income countries have government sectors that aren't quite as dynamic as you might want in kind of new city developments in low-income markets. And so we apply this public-private partnership model to include aspects of governance, whether that's a land registry, whether that's a business registration, zoning and land use, right? Thinking about how this kind of works in practice. So the ideal scenario is a city-scale jurisdiction with deep reforms. It would be governed by a city council. The city council members would be appointed by the host country, by developers, agreed upon third parties. You can also add in certain milestones to allow residents to vote when population benchmarks are hit. So typically in a homeowners association in the US, for example, the developer gets 3 votes for every unsold unit. So effectively the developer controls the HOA until 75% of units are sold. Why? Because they want to ensure that they keep the environment nice until they're able to recoup their initial capital investment. The development is paid for in return from investment from land sales as well as leases. And I think this is a very, one of the challenges that we face is how do we actually create these financial models targeting these lower income segments that allow this to work. The short answer is I don't know. The long answer is we're trying to figure it out. It's what I spend a substantial amount of my time thinking about. And thinking about this as a city development, not as a special economic zone, not as an industrial park, but with mixed use, long-term growth potential that can have a self-evolving dynamic over time. Before this talk, I read Astrid's paper where she mentioned some of the critiques that she then mentioned in this talk, so I figured I'd try to respond. And so they can be greenfield cities. I think it is possible to do those, though finding locations for that make sense is very hard, and the initial capital requirements are extremely difficult. So I think most of these charter city developments are likely to be in the growth path of existing urban areas. One example, Curtis and I were recently in Zanzibar. There's a special economic zone on a peninsula to the south of Zanzibar city that's existed for 30 years, but is basically being very poorly managed. There's a local developer that's built about 1,000 units. And then there are several local villages. The units, the lowest price point for the units is $20,000. Local villages, my guess is their income's about $1,000 per capita, are expanding into the zone. And so what we were discussing there is, look, how can we create this public-private partnership model for the zone, allow the expansion of this existing successful urban settlement that's too high a price point for the locals, but then also figure out a financial model that works with the expanding villages and also can offer them kind of the possibility of productivity increases over time to allow them to eventually reach that price point, or at a minimum their children to reach that price point. So thinking a lot about, how can we push this price point down? How can we provide public services for these lower income segments, as well as connectivity and regional integration, right? Cities are not islands. They depend on the areas around them, and ensuring that there is good connectivity, that it is integrated into economic and social networks to make sure that it's not this thing that exists ex nihilo. So some additional benefits of, I think, the PPP model. One is it can help reverse the logic of collective action. Typically, the logic of collective action is used to explain why bad economic policies stay in place, for example, sugar tariffs. But if you have financial interests that are benefiting from broad liberalization that increases the productivity of land, they are going to push for that liberalization. Second, that incentive creates a replication model where once you have it done once, right? The capital will say, hey, look, let's do this again, let's do this again. It's financially sustainable. Once you can crack that model, once you can figure out how to generate returns for lower income segments, that works. One example I remember actually from my high school economics class is Toyota, for example, sells a lot more cars than Mercedes. Obviously, Mercedes cars are more expensive, but the market for a Toyota is much bigger, and it's a much larger car company. Similarly, there are a lot more lower income people of 1,000, 2,000 per income around the world than there are people in these higher income segments. So if somebody is able to figure out how to crack that market and open it up, then you get this built-in market dynamic that kind of takes over and can apply that in a lot more contexts. So I figured I'd end by talking a little bit. I left the Charter Cities Institute, at least my role as executive director, about a year ago to pursue a project. We're in the Western Hemisphere. There's basically an underperforming special economic zone that's existed for decades. They own tens of thousands of acres of land. There's decent infrastructure, a port, an airport, a small population. We've met with the Prime Minister on several occasions. They're quite sympathetic to our vision. And so we're, I think, really trying to figure out what does this mean in practice. It's one thing to have this high-level idea. It's another to actually implement it. And so what at Bravo Cities, as well as the Charter Cities Institute, we spend a lot of time thinking about is what does it mean to translate this? How do we actually get the legal framework right? How do we get the urban infrastructure right? How do we get the financial structure right? How do we get the relationship with government right? And we believe that this can really help solve some of the most pressing problems facing the world in this century. So thank you very much.